James from Staten Island. I don't watch WWE as much as I used to because it's just hard for me to get invested when I know they don't care. But the few clips I see online, they are constantly pushing the narrative that John Cena is the greatest of all time. And to me, it is just nauseating. First off, what did he do that had bigger impact than guys like Hogan, Austin, Rock, Andre, Undertaker, Brett, Shawn, Flair, and Dusty? Secondly, WWE used to have a lot more people watching their show, and anyone that checks the ratings during the Cena run can see that there was a sizable portion of the audience that quit watching. At my last point, he was a babyface character that was getting booed out of the building relentlessly for over a decade. In other words, he could not do his job right, which was to get people behind him. I've never understood how anyone can say John Cena is the greatest ever simply because he had no scandals and he did a lot of charity work. Just because someone is a better person doesn't mean that they were better at their job. Am I crazy or do I have a point? So, when it comes to this greatest of all time stuff, and they have been calling John Cena the greatest of all time now for a few years. So I think even back a couple of years ago when he came back to wrestle Roman Reigns, they were calling him the greatest of all time. That is a Vince McMahon thing. That started under Vince before all the scandals and everything, and everything kind of changed there for 6 months. That's a Vince McMahon call. It's their branding. They want John Cena referred to as the greatest of all time. And the greatest of all time stuff is all subjective. There is no one singular greatest of all time. There's just too many variables involved, including the era that they worked. Times change. Metrics change. Television and ratings change, etc., etc. WWE calling John Cena the greatest of all time, in the eyes of Vince McMahon, you got to think about it in terms of his 78-year-old eyeballs. Okay? In the eyes of Vince McMahon, I think that he truly believes that John Cena is the greatest superstar of all time. And it's not hard to see why. John Cena was the consummate pro. John Cena was the ultimate WWE superstar. He is everything that Vince McMahon could possibly want out of his top guy. He always looked great. He appealed to the kids. He sold tons of merch. He was the perfect ambassador for the company, right? More Make-A-Wishes granted than anybody else in history, which is a great thing. Never got into any trouble outside the ring. Vince McMahon did not have to worry about a scandal or a drug test failure or an airport outburst or a social media meltdown or a barroom brawl or anything like that. There were never two more loyal top guys for Vince than The Undertaker and John Cena. And the only reason they don't call The Undertaker the greatest of all time is because he wasn't as, mainstream marketable for them as John Cena was. Undertaker was never the face of the company the way that John Cena was. So Cena made them more money. But he also never questioned his boss on anything, it seems. And that was also one of his faults. Loyal to a fault. There were times where I wish he would have pushed back on decisions that Vince McMahon made. And he didn't. And that was sometimes to the detriment of the company. As far as the people that he was working with, it was to the detriment of his opponents. So I'm not surprised they branded Cena as the greatest of all time. He was deeply unpopular with a lot of fans for a good portion of his run. And Vince was so afraid, not only of turning him heel, but he was so afraid to get anybody else over at his level that there were a lot of people who probably could have gotten over at a top level who never did because they were fed to John Cena instead, or because Cena just had to go over on them. That's more on the booking than anything else. John Cena does not bear all of the responsibility for that. Now, do I think that John Cena is the greatest of all time? No, I don't. Does he belong in the conversation? Sure. He's worthy of being in the conversation because even though he had the machine behind him, and look, to a large extent, all these people have the machine behind them. You don't think Hogan didn't have the machine behind him? Like Roman Reigns right now has the machine behind him? Yeah, there are people like a Daniel Bryan who did not have the machine behind them, right, until they just sort of had to be dragged kicking and screaming. But to some extent, a lot of these top guys have had the machine put behind them. So yes, Cena had that. He was still a needle mover for the company at a time when they didn't have many other people moving the needle. And he had more longevity on top than all but a very select few in the history of that company. Steve Austin, let's use Stone Cold as an example. Steve Austin was way hotter as a star than John Cena was, but for a much shorter period of time. Austin's run at the top, that got derailed by injuries. But at his peak, no one was hotter than Stone Cold Steve Austin. The only one you could make an argument for would be Hulk Hogan. I'm talking like peak Hulkamania in the mid to late 80s. They built everything around that man. Vince McMahon went national on the back of Hulk Hogan. Rockin' wrestling. They gave the man his own cartoon. Hulk Hogan was a household name even with people who didn't watch wrestling. They knew who Hulk Hogan was, and probably do today. Although for some very different reasons in many cases, some not so great reasons. But this level of star power I'm talking about with Hogan and Austin, John Cena does not even come close. I'm talking in a wrestling sense now. Forget the movies and all the outside stuff. Like, he doesn't come close. Cena deserves to be in the conversation. And I also think he still doesn't get enough credit for his matches. He had some excellent matches, during his career with Edge and CM Punk and AJ Styles, Brock Lesnar, Seth Rollins, Daniel Bryan, Shawn Michaels. Even when he got demoted down the card a little bit, that U.S. title open challenge in 2015 was one of the more fun things on WWE television. And he had some great matches with that too. I remember one that he had with Cesaro. He gets a lot of crap for his in-ring work, but his resume of top matches is outstanding. So if you want to look at John Cena as someone who, as far as his in-ring portfolio is concerned, there are some people who still don't give, the guy his due, and I think it's bullshit, because if you really just stop and think about the matches he had, of course, as I say that, people will be like, oh yeah, well that was all because of the person he was in the ring with. Yes, as if these people were wrestling a fucking broom. It doesn't matter. Yes, he was in there with AJ Styles and Shawn Michaels, and some of these guys are the greats, right, of all time in the ring. But he still went out there and he had great matches with all of them. You can't just ignore that. You can't just give credit to one person because you don't like the other. It's bullshit. It's always been a bullshit argument. And that's to say nothing of the matches with The Rock. I didn't care for the second one, but the first one, it was okay. But they did huge business for them, especially that first match. And Rock coming back and wrestling a singles match for the first time in 8 years, that had a lot to do with that. But Cena was still part of that. So, is he the GOAT? Not to James, he's not. And he's not mine. But it's not as ludicrous as you make it out to be, because when you think about it, he's everything that Vince McMahon could ever ask for in a top star. If he could clone John Cena and have an army of them, he would do it in a heartbeat. If he can manufacture them on a product line and just churn them out one by one, he would do it. So it's no surprise that Vince McMahon thinks of John Cena as the greatest of all time.